A widow's beloved cat goes missing during a storm, leaving her heartbroken and desperate. Weeks later it returns, but something is horribly wrong. Tangled in its blood-matted fur is a chilling clue, a small yellowed tooth. As whispers fill her home and shadows creep closer, she's drawn into a horrifying mystery buried deep in the woods. What sinister force followed her cat back? And can she uncover the truth before it's too late? This gripping tale will keep you on edge until the very last moment. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled through the ancient oaks surrounding Mary Grayson's farmhouse, their branches scraping against the weathered siding like skeletal fingers. Inside, Mary settled into her familiar evening routine, finding comfort in the soft glow of her reading lamp as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Almost bedtime, Oliver," she murmured to her orange tabby, who lay curled up on the worn floral couch beside her. The cat had been her constant companion since Tom's passing 3 years ago, filling the lonely hours with his gentle purring and quiet presence. Lightning flashed, illuminating the living room in stark white. The thunder that followed made the windows rattle. Oliver's head shot up, his ears twitching. Mary noticed his tail beginning to puff up, something she hadn't seen him do before. "It's just a storm, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to stroke his fur. But before her hand could touch him, Oliver leaped from the couch. He darted to the front door, pawing frantically at the weather stripping. "Oliver, no!" Mary called out, but it was too late. The moment she opened the door to pull him back, the cat bolted into the darkness. The wind yanked the door wider, sending rain spattering across her face. "Oh, Lord!" Mary whispered, her heart racing. She rushed to the coat closet, hands trembling as she pulled on her yellow raincoat. The flashlight was right where she always kept it, on the shelf by the door. She flicked it on, testing the beam before stepping out into the deluge. "Oliver!" she called, her voice nearly lost in the wind. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, catching raindrops like falling stars. She made her way down the porch steps, careful on the slick wood. The ground had turned to mud, sucking at her boots as she trudged across the yard. Each flash of lightning made her jump, but she pressed on, sweeping her flashlight back and forth across the property. "Oliver, please come back." Her clothes were soaked through now, despite the raincoat. She pushed wet strands of gray hair from her face, blinking against the rain. Hours passed as Mary searched, her calls growing hoarser. The beam of her flashlight caught something ahead, a twisted root jutting from the ground. Before she could stop herself, her foot caught it. She pitched forward, landing hard on her hands and knees. "Ouch!" she cried out, feeling the sting as her knee split open. Mud and blood mixed on her pants leg, but she forced herself back up. Oliver needed her. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Mary's shoulders slumped as exhaustion and cold seeped into her bones. She had searched everywhere she could think of, with no sign of her beloved cat. Defeated, she turned back toward the house. That's when something caught her eye in the mud. Oliver's blue collar, partially buried in the muck. Her hand shook as she picked it up, the little bell still attached, but silent. Back inside, Mary collapsed onto the couch, clutching the muddy collar to her chest. Thunder boomed overhead as tears rolled down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. "Please be okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please come home." 3 weeks after Oliver's disappearance, Mary sat at her kitchen table, pushing a cold cup of tea between her hands. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting the worn linoleum floor in strips of amber light. The house felt emptier than ever without her feline friend's presence. A sudden scratching sound at the back door made her freeze. Her heart thundered in her chest as she slowly rose from her chair. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. "Oliver?" Her voice trembled as she approached the door. "Is that you?" With shaking fingers, she turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. There, on the back step, sat Oliver, thin and dirty, but alive. His usually pristine orange coat was matted and covered in mud. "Oh, my precious boy!" Mary dropped to her knees, gathering him into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, feeling his familiar warmth against her chest. "I thought I'd lost you forever." She carried him to the bathroom, filling the sink with warm water. As she gently worked the tangles from his fur with pet shampoo, her fingers caught on something hard. Carefully, she worked it free from the matted fur near his shoulder. Mary's breath caught in her throat. In her palm lay a small yellowed tooth, unmistakably human, unmistakably a child's. "How did you—" She shook her head, trying to dismiss the chill that ran down her spine. "You must have found it while you were out scavenging, right?" Oliver just blinked at her with his large green eyes. After drying him off, Mary filled his food bowl and watched him eat ravenously. "Everything's going to be fine now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You're home safe." As night fell, Mary settled into bed, relieved to have Oliver back. But just as she was drifting off, a faint scratching sound came from her window. She sat up, straining to listen. The scratching moved to another window, accompanied by what sounded like whispers, too soft to make out words, but distinctly human. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned, sounds she'd grown used to over the years suddenly taking on a more sinister quality. Mary got up and checked every lock, trying to calm her racing heart. Back in bed, the whispers continued, seeming to drift down the hallway outside her room. Oliver sat perfectly still by the window, his rigid posture unusual for him. His eyes were fixed on something in the darkness beyond the glass, something Mary couldn't see. The night wrapped around Mary's farmhouse like a thick blanket, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. In her bedroom, Mary pulled her quilted covers tighter, trying to find comfort in their familiar warmth. Oliver perched on the windowsill, his silhouette dark against the moonlit glass. Sleep came fitfully, pulling her under in waves until the dream took hold. There, at the edge of the shadowy woods, stood a child, pale as moonlight, with hollow cheeks and sad eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. Mary's heart ached at the sight. The child's clothes hung in tatters, moving slightly in a wind she couldn't feel. Tears rolled silently down the young face as a small, trembling hand rose to point toward the dense forest. Mary tried to speak, to ask what was wrong, but her voice wouldn't come. The child's gaze held her frozen, filled with such deep sorrow that it made her chest tight with grief. She jerked awake with a gasp, her nightgown damp with sweat. The dream clung to her like cobwebs, those hollow eyes still vivid in her mind. Her hands shook as she pushed back her silver hair, trying to steady her racing heart. Morning light eventually crept through her windows, but it brought little comfort. Oliver sat rigid by the back door, his tail twitching nervously. His green eyes were fixed on the woods beyond, unwavering and intense. "What is it, Oliver?" Mary asked, her voice rough from a restless night. The cat's strange behavior made her stomach twist with anxiety. Oliver meowed softly, pawing at the door. Something pulled at Mary, like an invisible thread tugging her toward the woods. She hesitated, the dream child's face flashing in her memory. With trembling fingers, she slipped on her worn cardigan and followed Oliver outside. The morning air was cool and damp as they made their way across the overgrown yard. Oliver led her past the garden, through tall grass and brambles she hadn't tended in years. They came to a stop in a forgotten corner of her property, where thick vines cascaded over what looked like an old stone structure. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she pushed aside the curtain of greenery. There, hidden beneath years of neglect, stood a well. Its stones were crumbling, dark with age and moss. As she stepped closer, a chill breeze rose from its depths, carrying the musty scent of stagnant water and decay. Her hands trembled as she gripped Oliver close to her chest. "We should go back to the house," she whispered, but her eyes remained fixed on the well's dark mouth, unable to look away from its bottomless shadow. The morning sun cast long shadows as Mary pulled up to Mr. Finch's weathered farmhouse. The old man was already on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair, his white eyebrows knitted together as he watched her approach. "Morning, Mr. Finch," Mary called out, climbing the creaky steps. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Mary Grayson," he nodded, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his rocker. "What brings you out this way?" Mary settled into the empty chair beside him, smoothing her skirt. "I found something on my property yesterday, an old well hidden under vines. I was hoping you might know something about it." The change in Mr. Finch was immediate. His face paled and the gentle rocking stopped abruptly. "That well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Best leave it be, Mary. Some things are better left buried." "But why?" Mary leaned forward, noticing how his hands trembled slightly. "Strange things have been happening since Oliver came back. I found a child's tooth in his fur, and I've been having these dreams." "Stop!" Finch's voice cracked like a whip. His pale blue eyes darted toward the woods. "Don't speak of such things. That well, there are dark stories, Mary. Dark rumors that go back generations." "Please, Mr. Finch," Mary pressed, her heart pounding. "I need to know what's happening." The old man shook his head firmly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No good comes from digging up the past. Leave it alone, Mary. For your own sake, leave it be." As Mary stood to leave, frustration and worry churning in her stomach, she noticed how Finch's eyes kept darting between her and the tree line. His fingers drummed nervously on his chair, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Thank you for your time," Mary said quietly, descending the porch steps. Walking back to her car, she felt Finch's anxious gaze following her. She glanced back to see him still watching, his face drawn with worry as he looked again toward the woods. The drive home gave Mary time to think about Finch's reaction. His warnings only deepened her unease, but they also strengthened her resolve to understand what was happening. As she pulled up to her farmhouse, Mary stood on the porch, her eyes drawn to the distant trees, where she knew the well lay hidden. Finch's warning echoed in her mind, but something stronger pulled at her, a need to uncover the truth behind the mysterious well and the pale child from her dreams. Mary sat in her favorite armchair by the crackling fireplace, trying to find comfort in its warm glow. The events at Mr. Finch's house kept replaying in her mind. Oliver lay curled at her feet, but his usual peaceful demeanor was gone. His ears twitched at every small sound, his tail flicking with nervous energy. A whisper, so faint she almost missed it, drifted through the walls. Mary straightened in her chair, straining to listen. "Just the wind," she murmured to herself, but her hands gripped the armrest tightly. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though she couldn't make out any words. Her throat went dry as soft, deliberate footsteps creaked across the ceiling above. Someone or something was walking in the upstairs hallway. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Only the whispers answered. With shaking hands, Mary grabbed her flashlight from the side table. "Come on, Oliver," she whispered, but the cat remained rooted to the spot, his fur standing on end. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, the beam of her flashlight dancing across the walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart thundering in her chest. When she reached the top, the beam of light fell on her bedroom door, and she gasped. Deep claw marks ran down the wood, as if something massive had tried to tear its way inside. They looked fresh, the wood still splintered and raw. Oliver appeared beside her, his back arched and fur bristling. He let out a low, threatening hiss at the empty hallway. "Is someone there?" Mary called again, her voice echoing in the darkness. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Then she heard it, whispers floating down from above, from the attic. They sounded like children's voices, but distorted, wrong somehow. Fear gripped her chest like an icy hand. Mary backed away from the attic access, nearly stumbling down the stairs in her haste. She rushed to the kitchen, Oliver close at her heels. Her trembling hands fumbled with the drawer handle as she grabbed a large kitchen knife. She pushed a chair against the kitchen door, then huddled in the corner with Oliver pressed against her side. The knife felt cold and useless in her grip as she stared at the ceiling, listening to the whispers and creaks that echoed through her once peaceful home. Hours crawled by, each sound making her flinch. The feeling of being watched never left, as if countless unseen eyes were fixed upon her from every shadow. Mary's hands trembled as she poured her morning coffee, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. The weak sunlight filtering through her kitchen window did little to ease her nerves. Oliver sat perched on the windowsill, his tail twitching nervously as he watched the woods beyond. "I need answers," she whispered, setting down her half-empty cup. With determined steps, Mary grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the attic stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under her feet as she climbed. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, and the musty smell of age filled her nostrils. The attic was cluttered with forgotten furniture and boxes, remnants of decades past. As she moved deeper into the space, her light caught something beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Mary carefully pulled them aside, revealing an ornate wooden chest. Its brass fittings were green with age, but the wood remained solid despite the years. Her heart quickened as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, but the name, Rebecca Halloway, was still visible, etched in faded gold letters. Mary settled onto an old trunk and opened the diary with careful fingers. The pages were brittle, filled with elegant handwriting that spoke of a different time. As she read, her blood ran cold. March 15, 1892. Tommy disappeared today. Like Sarah before him, he said he heard voices calling from the woods. I searched until my feet bled, but found nothing. Only 2 children left now. Dear God, help us. Mary's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading entry after entry of Rebecca's mounting desperation. April Sue, 1892. Lost sweet Emma today. The voices took her too. Only my little James remains. I hear them now, calling in the night. They promise to return my children if I make a trade. I must try. What choice does a mother have? The final entry was barely legible, the writing frantic and scattered across the page. It lied. The voice in the well lied. James is gone, and I am damned. I made the bargain, but it took them all. My children, my precious children. Let this be a warning to any who come after. The well holds only darkness and lies. Mary's throat tightened as she recognized the parallels to her own experiences, the whispers, the strange occurrences, Oliver's behavior. Everything connected to that old well hidden in the woods. A sudden crash from downstairs made her jump. the diary nearly slipping from her grasp. Heart pounding, she clutched the book to her chest and moved toward the attic stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Mary sat in her favorite armchair by the window, Rebecca's diary open in her lap. The evening shadows stretched long across her living room floor as she turned another brittle page. Oliver prowled near the back door, his low growls breaking the silence. "Little Mary, quite contrary." The soft, haunting melody drifted through the walls. Mary's fingers froze on the diary's page, her breath catching in her throat. The singing was clear, a child's voice, sweet, but somehow wrong, like honey gone bad. Her eyes darted to the window. There, at the tree line, stood the pale child from her dream. Its dress hung in tatters, moving slightly in a breeze Mary couldn't feel. The child's hollow eyes fixed on her, unblinking and dark as empty wells. "Oh, God," Mary whispered, her hands shaking so badly the diary slipped from her grip. She couldn't look away from those eyes, deep and hungry as the darkness itself. The child raised one thin arm, pointing deeper into the woods. Its movements were jerky, like a broken puppet. Then, with terrible slowness, it turned away and began walking into the shadows between the trees. Oliver yowled, throwing himself at the back door. His claws scraped against the wood in desperate swipes, leaving deep marks in the paint. The sound jolted Mary from her paralysis, but she couldn't make herself move toward the door. "I should follow," she whispered, but her legs wouldn't respond. The urge to go after the child pulled at her like a physical force. Yet terror kept her rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. Oliver's frantic scratching grew more intense. He meowed loudly, a sound full of distress and warning. Mary watched him pace and claw at the door, her mind spinning with conflicting impulses. The woods beyond her window seemed to darken, as if night was falling faster there than anywhere else. Her legs gave out, and she sank into her chair. Rebecca's diary lay fallen at her feet, its pages open to an entry about voices in the night. Mary stared at the back door, her thoughts racing between the pale child, the mysterious well, and the curse that seemed to connect them all. Mary's hands trembled as she traced the deep claw marks on her back door. They were identical to the ones upstairs, 3 jagged lines carved into the wood, still fresh from the night before. She took a deep breath, grabbed Rebecca's diary, and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Come on, Oliver," she whispered. Her loyal cat padded beside her as she stepped outside. The morning air felt heavy and thick. Following the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth, Mary ventured deeper into the woods. Shadows grew longer as the trees closed in around her. Each step took her further from the safety of her farmhouse, but something pulled her forward, a need to understand what connected her to Rebecca's tragic story. Oliver stayed close, his tail twitching as he guided her through the dense undergrowth. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, covered in decades of fallen leaves. After about 20 minutes of walking, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. Mary's breath caught in her throat. Hidden among the twisted branches and overgrown vines stood a collection of weather-worn headstones. Moss covered most of the markers, but as she drew closer, she could make out the name Halloway carved into the granite. Her hands shaking, Mary brushed away the thick growth from one of the smaller stones. Crude symbols had been etched into the surface, strange markings that made her skin crawl. She moved from grave to grave, finding the same mysterious symbols on each of the children's headstones. Kneeling beside the smallest grave, Mary noticed something protruding from the earth. Her heart pounded as she realized they were bones, partially unearthed by recent rains. Small bones, a child's bones. Without thinking, she reached out to touch one of them. The moment her fingers made contact, a whisper carried on the wind. "Mary?" She jerked her hand back, her whole body going cold. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mary!" Oliver hissed, his fur standing on end. Mary scrambled to her feet, her legs weak with fear. She turned and ran, branches whipping at her face as she fled back toward her house. The diary bounced heavily in her pocket with each step. Bursting out of the tree line, Mary didn't slow down until she reached her back porch. She spun around, panting, to face the woods. Though nothing moved among the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Oliver pressed against her legs, letting out a low growl as they both stared at the dark forest before them. Mary sat in her armchair by the flickering fire, her fingers tracing the worn edges of Rebecca's diary. The whisper from the cemetery still echoed in her mind, making her shiver despite the warmth of the flames. Oliver curled up at her feet, his tail twitching nervously. A soft scraping sound made her look up. The rocking chair in the corner moved slightly, its wooden runners creaking against the floor. No breeze stirred the curtains. Mary's throat went dry as she watched the chair rock back and forth, picking up speed. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. Books suddenly tumbled from the shelf beside her, making her jump. They hit the floor with dull thuds, pages fluttering open. The whispers she'd heard before grew louder, filling the room with unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. A loud crack split the air. Mary spun around to see the large mirror above the fireplace fracture, spreading like a spider's web across the glass. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of desperate voices that made her cover her ears. Hours later, Mary jolted awake in her bed, her heart racing. The house felt different, emptier somehow. "Oliver," she called out, reaching for the spot where he usually slept. Finding it empty, she grabbed her flashlight with trembling hands and searched room by room. "Oliver, where are you?" Her voice echoed through the silent house. A rustling sound from outside caught her attention. Through the window, she saw movement in the trees. Despite every instinct telling her to stay inside, Mary pulled on her coat and stepped out into the night. The beam of her flashlight caught fresh paw prints in the damp earth. She followed them, pushing through branches and undergrowth, her breath coming in short gasps. The prints led her straight to the old well. There, sitting perfectly still in the moonlight, was Oliver. His eyes glowed with an unnatural green light, fixed on something she couldn't see. "Oliver," Mary whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't move or acknowledge her presence. The air around the well felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Something watched from the shadows, its presence palpable in the darkness. Mary stood at the edge of the well, her heart pounding as she double-checked the thick rope she'd tied to an old oak tree. The morning sun offered little warmth as she pulled on her work gloves and tested the rope's strength one final time. Her flashlight felt heavy in her coat pocket, a reminder of what she was about to do. "I have to know," she whispered to herself, gripping the rope tightly. Oliver watched from nearby, his tail twitching anxiously. The descent into the well was slow and terrifying. Each foot down brought a deeper chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Her flashlight beam bounced off the slick stones, revealing patches of dark green moss and deep cracks in the ancient walls. The whispers started softly at first, like leaves rustling in the wind. But as she climbed lower, they grew clearer, more insistent. The air turned frigid, her breath coming out in visible puffs. When her feet finally touched the bottom, Mary swept her flashlight beam around the circular space. Her light caught something white protruding from the mud. Bones. Her stomach lurched as she made out the shape of a small hand clutching what looked like a crude necklace. Forcing herself to look closer, Mary saw that the skeleton's fingers were wrapped around a collection of handmade talismans. She recognized the strange symbols carved into them, the same ones she'd seen on the cemetery headstones. The whispers suddenly grew hostile, echoing off the well's walls. "Intruder!" they hissed. "Leave!" The words seemed to come from everywhere at once, making her head spin. Something cold brushed against her arm like ghostly fingers. Mary spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through empty air. The touch came again on her other side, but nothing was there. A low, inhuman growl filled the well. Mary's flashlight beam flickered weakly as she turned toward the sound. There, in the corner, darkness seemed to gather and thicken, taking on a vaguely human shape. The shadow moved toward her, growing larger. Mary's flashlight sputtered, threatening to die. Above, she heard Oliver's desperate yowling, spurring her into action. She grabbed the rope and began to climb, her muscles burning with effort as the shadow reached for her with formless hands. She scrambled upward, her breath coming in terrified gasps as the presence below her grew stronger. Oliver's cries guided her toward the surface like a beacon. With one final burst of strength, Mary pulled herself over the well's edge and collapsed onto the ground, gulping in the fresh air. Mary sat at her kitchen table, her hands still trembling from her encounter at the well. The coffee in her mug had long gone cold, untouched. Oliver paced back and forth across the kitchen floor, his tail puffed up and his movements jerky and strange. As night fell, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and writhe. A chill crept through the house, making Mary pull her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The first sign something was wrong came when she heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps that made the old floorboards creak. Then she saw it, a dark figure forming in the doorway. The shadow twisted and took shape, becoming a woman in an old-fashioned dress. Her face was contorted with rage and pain, her eyes hollow with grief. "You!" The spirit of Rebecca Halloway shrieked, her voice echoing through the house. "How dare you disturb what lies beneath? You're making everything worse." Mary stumbled backward, knocking over her chair. I just want to help," she stammered. "Help?" Rebecca's laugh was bitter and sharp. "That's what I thought too. I tried to save them, my children, but it tricked me." Her form flickered like a candle flame. "The entity in the woods, it promised to return them if I performed its ritual. But it lied." The house began to shake. Pictures crashed from the walls and cabinet doors flew open, their contents spilling onto the floor. Dark shadows slithered up the walls like living things. "Every time you interfere," Rebecca wailed, "it grows stronger. It feeds on your meddling, your hope, your fear." A window shattered, sending glass spraying across the room. "Stop before it's too late. It will demand more than you can ever give." The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Furniture toppled as the house groaned and shuddered. Oliver yowled from somewhere in the chaos. "Leave this place!" Rebecca's final scream rattled the remaining windows. "Leave while you still can!" Then she vanished, leaving only her warning hanging in the air. "It demands more than you can give." Mary stood in her destroyed kitchen, glass crunching under her feet. She clutched Rebecca's diary to her chest, her breath coming in short gasps as she surveyed the damage around her. Oliver emerged from under the table, pressing against her legs with a soft whimper. Mary sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by shards of broken glass and overturned furniture from Rebecca's violent manifestation. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Her trembling hands held Rebecca's diary. carefully turning its weathered pages to the final entries. "The symbols must be combined," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Earth from the graves, bones from the well, bound by blood freely given." Oliver rubbed against her leg, purring softly as if trying to comfort her. Rising from her chair, Mary gathered her supplies. She'd collected small bones from the well and dirt from the children's graves. Her hands shook as she arranged them on the table, following Rebecca's detailed drawings. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. A picture frame crashed to the floor, making Mary jump. Then another. Books flew off shelves as an angry wind whipped through the house. The whispers started, first as gentle murmurs, then building to a crescendo of screaming voices. "You cannot stop this," they shrieked. "Leave now." Mary pressed on, her fingers working quickly to bind the items together with twine. Oliver stood guard beside her, his fur bristling as he growled at the dancing shadows that crept along the walls. A door slammed upstairs, then another and another, like dominoes falling through the house. Windows shattered inward, spraying glass across the floor. Mary ducked, shielding her face with her arms. Still, she continued working, weaving the components together as Rebecca had described. Her hands steady now, despite her racing heart. Using a small knife, Mary pricked her finger, allowing 3 drops of blood to fall onto the completed talisman. "Freely given," she whispered, echoing Rebecca's words. The moment the last drop fell, the chaos stopped. The house went completely silent, as if suspended in time. Even the dust motes hanging in the sunbeams seemed frozen. Oliver's growl died in his throat as he stared intently at the fireplace. Mary rose on shaking legs, clutching the talisman. Each step toward the fireplace felt like walking through deep water, the air thick and resistant. She could feel unseen eyes watching her, waiting. With a deep breath, Mary tossed the talisman into the flames. The fire exploded upward, reaching impossible heights within the confines of the fireplace. The flames turned an unnatural blue-white, casting writhing shadows across the walls that seemed to scream in silent agony. Heat blasted her face as she stumbled backward, falling onto the floor beside Oliver. The cat remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the supernatural flames as they consumed the talisman. Mary watched in stunned silence as the shadows twisted and contorted, their movements becoming more frantic and desperate with each passing moment. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows of Mary's farmhouse, casting long beams across the destruction from the night before. Shards of glass glittered on the floor like morning dew, and toppled furniture cast strange shadows in the early light. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy blanket had been lifted from the house. Mary's eyes found Oliver sitting serenely by the cold fireplace. She blinked, noticing something strange about his appearance. His usually solid black fur was now streaked with patches of white, as if he'd aged overnight. Yet his posture was relaxed, his eyes calm as they met hers. Something about his steady gaze made her shiver despite the morning warmth. "Well, Oliver," she whispered, her voice rough from exhaustion, "should we see what's left out there?" Taking a deep breath, Mary stepped onto her front porch. The wooden boards creaked under her feet, normal, everyday sounds that somehow felt too loud in the morning stillness. Her yard looked exactly as it always had, the grass still wet with dew, but something felt off. As she walked toward the tree line, Mary realized what was wrong. The woods were completely silent. No birds sang their morning songs, no squirrels chattered in the branches. Even the leaves hung motionless, though she could feel a slight breeze on her skin. The oppressive weight that had haunted the property for weeks had lifted, but this unnatural quiet felt almost worse. Her feet carried her along the familiar path to where the well had stood. Mary stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. The well was gone, not just covered or damaged, but completely erased from existence. The ground showed no sign it had ever been there. No foundation stones, no disturbed earth, not even a depression in the soil. Wild grass grew uniformly across the spot where just yesterday she had thrown the talisman into her fireplace. As she stood there, staring at the impossible absence, the hair on the back of her neck prickled. Though the suffocating presence of the curse seemed broken, something still watched from the shadows between the trees. It wasn't the same malevolent force as before. This felt different, more distant, like eyes observing from behind a veil. Mary backed away slowly, keeping her eyes on the tree line. Her heart pounded as she made her way back to the house, each step carefully placed. When she reached her porch, she turned to face the woods one final time. "It's over," she whispered, but her voice wavered with uncertainty as she spoke the words into the unnatural silence. Mary sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, grateful for its warmth and light. Oliver's weight on her lap provided comfort as she stroked his fur, now streaked with patches of white that hadn't been there before. The boards covering her broken windows cast strange shadows across the room, but for the first time in weeks, the farmhouse felt like home again. Her mind wandered through the events of the past few days: the well, the cemetery, Rebecca's diary, and the terrifying entity that had haunted this land for so long. Her hands trembled slightly as she remembered the shadows that had tried to claim her in the well's depths. The memory of Rebecca's tortured spirit made her heart ache with sympathy. "At least it's over now," she whispered to Oliver, who purred contentedly in response. The cat's eyes, once filled with an unnatural gleam, now held only their usual golden warmth. The crackling fire and Oliver's gentle purring began to lull her toward sleep. Her eyes grew heavy, and her thoughts became fuzzy around the edges. Just as she was about to drift off completely, a whisper broke through the quiet. "Thank you." The words were so soft she might have imagined them, but Mary's eyes snapped open anyway. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, taking in the familiar shapes of her furniture cast in firelight. Nothing seemed out of place. Oliver remained calm on her lap, showing none of the agitation that had marked the presence of evil before. She had almost convinced herself she'd imagined it when the whisper came again, just as gentle but unmistakably real this time. "Thank you." Mary's breath caught in her throat. The voice held none of the malice she'd come to associate with the supernatural events in her home. Instead, it carried a note of peace, almost gratitude. It reminded her of the way Rebecca's voice had sounded in her earliest diary entries, before tragedy had twisted her with grief and rage. She searched the shadows cast by the boards on her windows, but saw nothing unusual. The fire crackled steadily, and Oliver dozed on, unconcerned. The tension in her shoulders began to ease as she realized that whatever this was, it meant her no harm. Mary pulled Oliver closer, taking comfort in his warm presence as she watched the flames dance lower in the fireplace. The whisper didn't come again, but its echoes lingered in her mind, leaving her with an unexpected sense of closure. Sunlight streamed through Mary's bedroom window, casting warm patterns across her quilted bedspread. The house felt different this morning, not just quiet, but utterly still. Even the usual morning sounds of settling wood and creaking pipes were absent, creating an almost pristine silence that made her ears strain for any noise at all. Mary walked from room to room, running her hands along the walls where shadows had once writhed and twisted. The broken windows were still covered with boards, but the glass shards had been swept away, leaving clean floors that showed no trace of the supernatural violence that had erupted days before. Oliver followed at her heels, his paws making soft padding sounds that seemed unusually loud in the quiet house. His fur still bore those strange white streaks, but his behavior had returned to normal. No more rigid staring or unexplained hissing at empty corners. The stillness felt almost too perfect, like a held breath. Mary paused at her kitchen window, gazing out at the woods that had harbored so many horrors. The trees stood motionless in the morning light, their branches reaching toward a cloudless sky. But something was missing. The usual chorus of birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, even the whisper of wind through leaves. The forest seemed frozen, like a photograph. She stepped outside, the wooden porch steps solid and silent beneath her feet. The air felt thick and heavy despite the bright sunshine. Mary walked to the edge of her yard, studying the tree line where she'd first seen the pale child, who had led her to uncover the truth about Rebecca Halloway and the curse. Back inside, Mary headed to her desk where Rebecca's diary lay. Her heart stuttered when she saw it was open, pages ruffled as if recently disturbed. Dark soil smeared the last page, forming words in an unfamiliar, jagged handwriting. "It's not over." A chill raced down Mary's spine as she stared at the message. Her fingers trembled as they traced the dirt-formed letters, the soil still damp and fresh. She pulled her hand back quickly, wiping it on her skirt. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered into the unnatural silence, but her shaking hands betrayed her fear as they gripped the edge of the desk. Mary sat in her favorite armchair, trying to focus on her knitting as the sun dipped below the horizon. The peaceful day was fading fast, replaced by an all-too-familiar heaviness that made her chest tight. She glanced at the diary on the side table, its ominous message still visible in the dim light. "It's not over." "Just my imagination," she whispered, but her voice sounded small in the growing darkness. "We beat it, didn't we, Oliver?" Oliver paced by the window, his tail twitching. His soft growls grew more insistent as shadows lengthened across the yard. His amber eyes remained fixed on the tree line, tracking something Mary couldn't see. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and Mary pulled her cardigan tighter. The warmth and peace she'd felt that morning felt like a distant memory now. Each creak of the old house made her jump, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual. Then came the knocking, 3 soft taps on the front door. Mary froze, her knitting needles suspended mid-stitch. Oliver's growl deepened. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was deliberate, almost polite. Mary's hands shook as she set down her knitting and stood up. Oliver pressed against her legs as she approached the door. Through the peephole, the porch appeared empty. Just darkness and the faint outline of her rocking chair swaying gently in the evening breeze. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as though whatever waited outside had all the time in the world. Then abruptly, silence fell. Mary held her breath, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Mary." The whisper came from just beyond the door, so faint she almost missed it. Oliver's fur bristled, and he planted himself firmly between Mary and the door, his growl now a continuous rumble of warning. Backing away slowly, Mary grabbed the flashlight from the side table and the kitchen knife she'd started keeping nearby. Her hands trembled as she sank into her chair by the fire, Oliver never leaving her side. "It's not real," she whispered, clutching the knife tighter. "It's not real. It's not real." A child's laugh, high and clear, drifted in through the window. Mary's blood ran cold as Oliver pressed closer to her, both of them waiting in terrified silence for what would come next. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as Mary stood before her front door, tracing the fresh claw marks with trembling fingers. They were deep and deliberate, nothing like the random scratches a wild animal might leave. Oliver paced anxiously near the attic stairs, his tail twitching with nervous energy. "I have to know," Mary whispered to herself, gathering her courage. She grabbed her small garden shovel and tucked it into her coat pocket. The weight of it felt reassuring against her hip as she stepped outside. The trail of claw marks led her back into the woods, carved into tree trunks and exposed roots. Each mark seemed to point the way, drawing her deeper into the forest's embrace. The morning dew had settled heavily on the leaves, making them glisten like tears in the filtered sunlight. As she approached the Halloway graves, her boots squelched in unexpectedly soft earth. Near the row of marked headstones, a patch of ground looked recently disturbed, the soil darker and looser than the surrounding area. Mary's heart pounded as she knelt beside it. With shaking hands, she began to dig. The earth gave way easily under her shovel, almost as if it wanted to reveal its secret. It wasn't long before she uncovered something wrapped in rotting cloth. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she carefully brushed away the soil. The bundle was small, too small. Her stomach turned as she realized she was looking at the remains of an infant. Clutched in what remained of its tiny hands was another crude talisman, its symbols matching those she'd found in the well. The talisman seemed to pulse with a cold energy as she lifted it from the grave. Its surface was rough against her fingers, the symbols crude but purposeful. The morning air grew thick and heavy around her. A scream shattered the silence, raw and filled with such anguish that Mary's blood ran cold. She spun around, nearly losing her balance, and saw a woman's shadow racing toward her through the trees. The figure's arms were outstretched, reaching desperately, but before it could touch her, it dissolved into wisps of gray mist. Mary stumbled backward, her fingers clenching around the talisman until its edges bit into her palm. Her ragged breathing seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence that followed. She stared into the woods, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen. But the trees offered no answers, standing silent and indifferent to her fear. Mary sat at her kitchen table, the talisman cold and heavy in her palm. Its crude symbols seemed to writhe in the dim light, making her eyes hurt if she looked too long. Oliver crouched by the darkened window, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The room began to spin slowly, like a carousel picking up speed. Mary gripped the edge of the table as her vision blurred and doubled. The walls of her kitchen melted away into darkness, replaced by dense woods under a moonless sky. There stood Rebecca Halloway, her face gaunt with desperation, surrounded by shifting shadows that seemed alive. She drew symbols in the dirt with trembling hands, her voice cracking as she chanted words Mary couldn't understand. Dark figures swayed around her, neither solid nor smoke, watching with unseen eyes. "Please," Rebecca begged, her words crystal clear despite the vision's dreamlike quality. "Take anything else, but save my children, please." The shadows converged, forming a mass of writhing darkness that spoke with many voices at once. "The price is more than flesh and blood," it hissed. "We require your soul's eternal torment." Rebecca's scream of anguish pierced the night as the shadows engulfed her. Then suddenly, Mary found herself standing where Rebecca had been, the same desperate words spilling from her own lips. The entity's presence crushed against her chest, suffocating and cold. With a violent jerk, Mary snapped back to her kitchen. She was drenched in sweat, her clothes sticking to her skin. Her breath came in short gasps as she slid from the chair onto the cool floor. Oliver pressed against her side as she wrapped her arms around him. "I won't let it win," she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward her like grasping fingers. Mary watched Oliver pacing near the attic stairs, his tail twitching nervously. Each time he passed the entrance, he would pause and stare upward, letting out a soft meow. Despite the fear churning in her stomach, Mary knew she had to investigate. The attic stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, flashlight beam cutting through dusty air. Oliver followed close behind, his paws making soft padding sounds on the wooden steps. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes, sat a small chest she hadn't noticed during her previous searches. Its dark wood was worn smooth with age, brass fittings dulled and tarnished. Mary's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, a single piece of paper lay yellowed and brittle. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized a crude drawing of the talisman she had burned in the fireplace. Below the drawing, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 chilling words. "You've only begun." A sudden gust of cold air whipped through the attic, scattering dust and making the paper flutter in her hands. From somewhere below, a deep guttural growl echoed through the house. Mary scrambled toward the stairs, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The growling grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The house began to shake violently, picture frames crashing to the floor as she descended. Shadows darted along the walls like living things, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached toward her with clawed hands. Her flashlight flickered rapidly, threatening to leave her in darkness. In the center of her living room, darkness gathered and solidified into a towering figure, formless and shifting like smoke. When it spoke, its voice alternated between Rebecca's desperate plea and the entity's otherworldly growl. "You've meddled too much. The price will be paid." Mary pressed herself against the wall, clutching the talisman so tightly its edges dug into her palm. The shadow figure loomed over her, its presence crushing the air from her lungs. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the entity vanished. The oppressive silence that followed felt deafening. Mary slid down the wall until she sat on the floor, her whole body shaking. She drew in a deep breath and whispered with determination, "This ends tonight." The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees as Mary gathered her supplies. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the talisman from the unmarked grave into her coat pocket. The weight of the flashlight and knife did little to calm her nerves, but she squared her shoulders, determined to end this nightmare. "Come on, Oliver," she whispered, and her cat padded silently beside her as she stepped into the woods. The temperature dropped with each step deeper into the forest. The usual chorus of crickets and night birds had fallen silent, leaving only the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Oliver stayed close, his fur bristling as they ventured further than they'd ever gone before. Mary's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and gnarled roots. The beam seemed to grow weaker the deeper they went, as if the darkness itself was swallowing the light. Her breath came out in visible puffs of vapor, despite the mild evening. After what felt like hours of walking, the trees suddenly opened into a clearing she'd never seen before. Mary's flashlight revealed an ancient stone altar in the center, its surface etched with familiar symbols, the same ones from the cemetery and Rebecca's diary. Moss and ivy had claimed much of the stone, but the carvings remained clear and sharp, as if recently cut. As she approached the altar, the air grew thick and heavy, making each step feel like wading through water. The shadows at the edges of the clearing seemed to pulse and writhe, growing darker and more substantial. Oliver growled low in his throat, backing away from the altar. A dark mist began seeping from the stone surface, twisting and coalescing into a human shape. Mary watched, frozen, as the figure shifted between Rebecca Holloway's grief-stricken face and something else. Something with too many angles and depths that hurt her eyes to look at. When it spoke, the voice was a horrifying blend of Rebecca's desperate pleading and something ancient and malevolent. "You should have heeded the warnings," it said, the words seeming to echo from everywhere at once. "Rebecca's failure bound me here. But your meddling—" The thing that was sometimes Rebecca laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your interference has only made me stronger. The price of her failed ritual must still be paid." The shadows crept closer, forming a tightening circle around Mary and the altar. She clutched the talisman in her pocket, feeling its cold surface bite into her palm. Fear coursed through her veins, but beneath it, anger began to burn hot and bright. "Not this time," she whispered, taking a deliberate step toward the altar. The dark mist coalesced into a towering figure, its form constantly shifting between Rebecca's tortured face and something far more sinister. The shadows around Mary thickened, making the air heavy and cold. "You've meddled in matters beyond your understanding," the entity spoke, its voice a discordant blend of whispers and screams. "But I can offer you peace, protection." The air shimmered, and suddenly Mary saw Oliver writhing in agony, her beloved farmhouse consumed by creeping shadows, and the hollow-eyed spirits of Rebecca's children trapped in endless torment. "Your cat, your home, your very life, I can preserve them all," the entity purred. "Just as I offered Rebecca. A simple exchange, a precious sacrifice." Mary's hands trembled as she clutched the talisman. "What kind of sacrifice?" The entity's form rippled, and Mary gasped as a vision of her own death filled her mind, her body broken at the bottom of the well, shadows feeding on her final breaths. "Your interference has bound you to this place," the entity hissed. "The curse flows through your veins now. Choose wisely. Embrace my offer, or share Rebecca's fate." Mary watched the vision swirl around her, Oliver's suffering, her home's destruction, her own death. The entity's words slithered through her mind, tempting and threatening. But something in its tone, the way it pushed and prodded, reminded her of Rebecca's desperate writings. "No," Mary said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You manipulated Rebecca, twisted her love for her children. I won't make the same mistake." The entity's form swelled with rage, the shadows pressing closer. "You dare refuse?" "I do," Mary declared, though fear made her heart race. A horrible laugh echoed through the clearing as the entity's form began dissolving into the darkness. Its final words hung in the air. "You'll regret your choice." Mary gripped the talisman tightly, her eyes fixed on the altar as she took careful steps backward toward the woods. Mary sat at her kitchen table, spreading out Rebecca's diary and the talisman from the unmarked grave. Oliver pressed against her leg, his warmth offering comfort in the growing darkness. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the diary's worn pages, studying Rebecca's frantic scribbles about symbols and rituals. "There has to be a way," she whispered, tracing the strange markings with her finger. The symbols from the well, cemetery, and altar began to form a pattern in her mind. She gathered the items she'd collected: the old tooth from Oliver's fur, fragments of bone from the well, and dirt from the unmarked grave. As Mary began crafting a new talisman, the house erupted in supernatural fury. Books flew off shelves, crashing against walls. Pictures crashed to the floor, glass shattering. Dark shadows whipped across the room like angry snakes, lashing at her arms and face. "No!" Mary shouted, refusing to stop her work. "I won't let you win." Oliver growled deeply, positioning himself between Mary and the worst of the shadows. His fur stood on end as he tracked the invisible threats with alert eyes. The whispers that had haunted the house for weeks rose to a deafening chorus of screams. Children crying, Rebecca's anguished wails, and underneath it all, something ancient and malevolent. Mary's fingers worked quickly, weaving the items together with string from Rebecca's diary binding. Her hands shook but remained steady enough to complete the intricate pattern she discovered in the journal's pages. The shadows grew more frenzied, the screams more desperate as she neared completion. Then, just as she tied the final knot, everything stopped. The shadows retreated to the corners. The screams died away. The house held its breath, waiting. The new talisman felt warm in Mary's palm, pulsing with a faint inner light. She stood slowly, gathering her courage for what came next. Oliver pressed against her legs, his growl a low rumble of warning and protection. She walked to the front door, each step echoing in the unnatural silence. The talisman's glow strengthened, casting strange patterns on the walls. Mary looked down at Oliver, her faithful protector throughout this nightmare. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice steady despite her fear. She gripped the doorknob, the metal cold beneath her fingers. Mary's footsteps crunched softly on the forest floor as she approached the altar. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and heavy like a wet blanket. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled. The woods held their breath, waiting. The entity materialized before she reached the stone surface, its form more solid than ever before. What had once been shifting shadows now took on a grotesque shape, part human and part nightmare. Rebecca's face twisted within its mass, contorted in eternal agony. "Foolish woman," it hissed, its voice grating like metal on stone. "Your pitiful attempts to fight me only make me stronger." The attack came without warning. Mary's mind flooded with images, her husband's death, endless nights of loneliness, every failure and regret she'd ever experienced. She saw herself as worthless, weak, unable to save even those she loved most. The visions threatened to drown her in despair. But Mary clutched the talisman tighter, feeling its warmth against her palm. She thought of Oliver waiting at home, of his unwavering loyalty through all the terror. She remembered the pale children trapped by this creature's malice, bound to the cursed land by its twisted bargains. "No more," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "You've taken enough." The talisman began to glow, first faintly, then with increasing brightness. Mary stepped forward, fighting against the pressure of the entity's presence. Each step felt like walking through mud, but she pressed on. "You cannot stop what has existed for centuries," the entity roared, its form writhing in fury. Mary reached the altar and lifted the talisman high. Its light cut through the darkness like a blade, making the entity shriek and recoil. With trembling hands, she placed the glowing object on the stone surface. Light exploded outward. The entity's screams became deafening as its form began to dissolve, torn apart by the talisman's power. The oppressive shadows that had choked the woods retreated, fleeing from the purifying radiance. Mary watched as the creature that had tormented so many lives thrashed and disintegrated. Its final wail echoed through the trees as it disappeared completely, leaving only clean, crisp air behind. The weight of exhaustion dropped her to her knees. A deep crack split the altar in two, and the suffocating energy that had permeated the land dissipated. In its place, a gentle glow remained, peaceful and warm like early morning sunlight. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Mary sat on a fallen log, her body aching from the night's ordeal. The altar, once an imposing structure of dark stone, now lay in ruins before her. Broken pieces scattered the ground, their ancient symbols faded and powerless. A soft glow caught her attention. Through the morning mist, ethereal figures began to take shape. Rebecca's children, their faces peaceful and serene. They appeared as gentle lights, like fireflies dancing in the dawn. Each child's spirit paused briefly, offering a small smile before dissolving into the mist. Rebecca's spirit remained after her children had gone. Her form was clearer than the others, her face no longer twisted with anguish, but bearing an expression of profound relief mixed with lingering sadness. Her eyes met Mary's, filled with gratitude and understanding. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, her voice carried on the morning breeze. Then she too faded away, leaving Mary alone in the clearing. The walk back to the farmhouse felt different. Where oppressive darkness had once ruled, morning light now filtered through the canopy. Birds called from the branches above, chickadees and cardinals announcing the new day. A squirrel scampered across her path, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. The air felt clean and fresh, like after a spring rain. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if a great weight had been lifted from the land itself. The path that had once seemed threatening now looked like any other forest trail, dappled with morning sunlight. As Mary approached her farmhouse, she saw Oliver waiting on the porch. His fur, still streaked with patches of white from his ordeal, caught the morning light. His tail raised in greeting, and his eyes held their usual calm warmth. Gone was the agitation and fear that had plagued him during the haunting. He trotted down the steps to meet her, rubbing against her legs with a content purr. Mary reached down to stroke his fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his purring beneath her hand. She made her way to the porch steps and sat down, drawing Oliver into her lap. Together, they watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. For the first time since the haunting began, Mary felt true peace settle over her home. The autumn sun warmed Mary's back as she knelt in her garden, carefully digging a small hole among the wildflowers. The remaining items from the well and cemetery lay wrapped in soft cloth beside her. Her hands, covered in garden gloves, moved with purpose through the rich soil. "This feels right," she whispered to herself, gently placing the bundle into the earth. Oliver watched from nearby, his tail curled around his paws, as Mary covered the items and marked the spot with a smooth river stone. Standing up, she surveyed her property. The broken windows had been replaced, letting sunlight stream freely into the house again. Fresh paint covered the claw marks on the doors, and she'd cleared away the debris from those terrifying nights. The house looked like home again, perhaps even more so than before. As she worked in her garden that afternoon, planting fresh flowers and clearing weeds, Mary thought about everything she'd endured. The fear that had gripped her during those dark nights now felt distant, replaced by a quiet confidence. She hadn't just survived the haunting, she'd faced it head-on and broken its hold on the land. That evening, Mary settled into her favorite armchair by the fireplace. Oliver jumped into her lap, purring contentedly as she stroked his fur. The flames danced in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Everything felt different now, more vibrant, more alive. Even the creaks and groans of the old house seemed friendly rather than threatening. Mary ran her fingers through Oliver's fur, remembering how he'd stood by her side through it all. His mysterious disappearance and return had started their journey, but his unwavering presence had given her strength when she needed it most. As she gazed into the flames, a whisper drifted through the room, gentle as a spring breeze. "You were stronger than I was. Thank you." Rebecca's voice carried no trace of the anguish that had haunted it before, only gratitude and peace. Mary felt a mix of sadness and warmth at the words, She understood now what Rebecca had endured, and how desperate she must have been to save her children. But where Rebecca had been trapped by the entity's manipulation, Mary had found the strength to break free. The night deepened, and stars began to twinkle through the new windows. Mary remained in her chair, Oliver dozing in her lap, feeling more at peace than she had in years. The house stood quiet and strong around her, no longer a place of fear, but a true sanctuary. If you enjoyed the story of Mary, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.